In the merciless heart of 1880s Wyoming Territory, a woman named Lila Carver hung from iron bars like a caged animal, her crime nothing more than being born poor and traveling alone. The town of Sagebrush Hollow had branded her vagrant trash, locked her in the town square under the scorching sun, and left her to bake in her own shame while decent folk passed by without a glance. But when a quiet widower named Jonah Reddick rolled his wagon into town with 5 motherless daughters, he did something no one expected. He broke the lock with his bare hands, lifted her out, and carried her home. What happened next would set the whole territory ablaze. If you're ready to hear how one act of defiance changed everything, stay with me until the very end. And drop a comment below with your city so I can see just how far Lila's story travels today. The cage wasn't even big enough to stand in. Lila Carver had been folded into that rusted square of iron for 2 days and 3 nights. Her knees pulled to her chest, her spine curved against metal bars that bit into her shoulders every time she tried to shift her weight. The sun rose over Sagebrush Hollow like a hammer coming down on an anvil, and by mid-morning the heat turned the cage into an oven. Sweat ran down her temples and pooled in the hollow of her throat. Her lips had cracked open days ago. Flies circled her head in lazy loops, drawn by the smell of unwashed skin and desperation. She didn't cry anymore. Tears were a luxury she couldn't afford. The cage sat in the center of the town square, right between the mercantile and the land office, so everyone who passed could see her. That was the point. Sheriff Daltrey had made it clear when he'd shoved her inside and snapped the padlock shut. You want to drift through our town like a piece of trash? We'll treat you like trash. Maybe 3 days in the sun will teach you to keep moving. Lila hadn't done anything wrong. She'd been walking the road from Casper to Cheyenne, looking for work, when 2 drunks outside the saloon had cornered her and tried to pull her into an alley. She'd fought back, clawed one man's face hard enough to draw blood, and run. But when she'd stumbled into the sheriff's office for help, Daltrey had taken one look at her torn dress, her dirty hands, and her empty pockets, and decided she was the problem. Vagrancy, he'd said, disturbing the peace. Assault. No trial, no questions, just iron bars and public shame. Now she sat in that cage while the good people of Sagebrush Hollow went about their business. Women in clean dresses crossed to the other side of the street so they wouldn't have to look at her. Men spat tobacco juice near the bars and muttered about her kind ruining decent towns. Children threw pebbles and laughed when she flinched. The only person who'd shown her a shred of kindness was a young girl, maybe 10 years old, who'd slipped her a biscuit through the bars on the second morning. The girl's mother had caught her and dragged her away by the arm, slapping the back of her head and hissing, "Don't you dare touch that filth again!" Lila had eaten the biscuit anyway. It was the first food she'd had in 48 hours. By the 3rd day, she wasn't sure she'd last much longer. The heat was brutal, but the thirst was worse. Her tongue felt thick and swollen in her mouth. Her thoughts started to drift and scatter like leaves in the wind. She kept seeing her mother's face, the way it had looked the day she died, pale and tired and so sad. Her mother had always told her, "You're stronger than you think, Lila. Don't let the world break you." But the world was doing a damn fine job of it. It was late afternoon when she heard the wagon. At first, it was just the creak of wheels and the soft thud of hooves on packed dirt. Lila didn't bother looking up. Wagons came through Sagebrush Hollow all the time, and none of them ever stopped for her. But then she heard something else. Children's voices, high and bright, asking questions the way children do. "Papa, why is that lady in a cage? Papa, is she hurt? Papa, can we help her?" Lila lifted her head, squinting against the sun. The wagon had stopped about 10 feet away, and a man was climbing down from the driver's seat. He was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in worn work clothes and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. 5 little girls sat in the back of the wagon, their eyes wide and worried as they stared at Lila through the bars. The man walked toward the cage slowly, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust. When he got close enough, he crouched down so he was at eye level with her, and Lila finally saw his face. He wasn't young, maybe 40 or so, with lines carved deep around his eyes and mouth. His hair was dark brown shot through with gray, and his jaw was rough with several days' worth of stubble. But it was his eyes that caught her, dark and steady, with a sadness in them that felt older than his years. He didn't say anything at first. He just looked at her, really looked at her, the way people used to look at human beings instead of problems. Finally, he spoke. His voice was low and quiet, like distant thunder. "How long you been in there?" Lila's throat was so dry that her first attempt at words came out as a rasp. She swallowed hard and tried again. 3 days. His jaw tightened. "They give you water?" "Yesterday morning, a cupful." One of the girls in the wagon called out, "Papa, she's thirsty." The man glanced back at his daughters, then stood and walked to the wagon. He pulled out a canteen and returned to the cage, holding it up to the bars. "Drink slow," he said. Lila's hands shook as she reached through and took the canteen. The first sip of water was like salvation. She wanted to gulp it down, drain the whole thing, but she forced herself to drink slowly the way he'd told her. When she finally lowered the canteen, she felt almost human again. "Thank you," she whispered. He nodded once, then stood and turned toward the land office. "Wait here." Lila almost laughed. "Wait here." As if she had a choice. She watched as the man walked across the square and disappeared into the land office. Through the open door, she could hear raised voices, the man's low and steady, Sheriff Daltrey's sharp and defensive. The conversation lasted maybe 5 minutes, and when the man came back out, his face was set like stone. Sheriff Daltrey followed him, moving fast, his hand already on his gun. "You can't just—" "I asked you what her crime was," the man said without stopping. "You said vagrancy. I asked you when her trial was. You said there wasn't one. That means she's not a criminal. That means this," he gestured at the cage, "is illegal. Now you listen here, Reddick." "No, you listen." The man, Reddick, stopped and turned to face the sheriff. He was taller by half a head, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the square. "You've got this woman locked in a cage in the middle of your town like some kind of animal. No trial, no charges that would stand up in any court. Just cruelty for cruelty's sake. So here's what's going to happen. You're going to unlock that cage, or I'm going to break it open myself." Daltrey's face turned red. "You threatening an officer of the law?" "I'm telling you what's right." Reddick's voice didn't rise, but there was iron in it. "Unlock it. Now!" For a long moment, Lila thought the sheriff might actually draw his gun. His hand twitched toward his holster, and she saw his fingers flex. But then he looked past Reddick at the 5 little girls watching from the wagon, and something in his face changed. Maybe it was shame. Maybe it was just calculation. Either way, he took his hand off his gun and pulled a keyring from his belt. "Fine," he muttered. "But she's your problem now, Reddick. Anything happens, it's on you." "I'll take that chance." Daltrey unlocked the padlock and yanked the cage door open with more force than necessary. The hinges screamed in protest. He stepped back, folded his arms, and waited. Lila tried to move, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. 3 days folded into that cramped space had left her muscles stiff and useless. She managed to shift forward a few inches, but when she tried to stand, her knees buckled and she nearly collapsed. Reddick was there before she hit the ground. He caught her with one arm around her back and the other under her knees, lifting her out of the cage like she weighed nothing. Lila was so startled that she didn't even think to protest. No one had touched her with kindness in so long that she'd almost forgotten what it felt like. "Easy," he said quietly. "I've got you." He carried her to the wagon and set her down gently on the tailgate next to his daughters. The girls immediately scooted closer, their small faces full of concern. "Papa, is she going to be okay?" the oldest one asked. She looked about 12, with dark braids and her father's serious eyes. "She will be," Reddick said. He pulled a blanket from the wagon bed and draped it around Lila's shoulders, even though the day was still hot. "Ruth, get the bread and cheese from the basket. Emma, fetch the other canteen." The girls moved quickly, and within moments Lila had food in her hands and water at her side. She wanted to thank them, wanted to say something that would capture the enormity of what they were doing for her. But all she could manage was, "Why?" Reddick was climbing back onto the driver's seat. He glanced back at her, and for the first time she saw something other than sadness in his eyes. It might have been anger, or maybe just determination. "Because it's right," he said simply. Then he snapped the reins, and the wagon lurched forward. As they rolled out of Sagebrush Hollow, Lila looked back and saw Sheriff Daltrey still standing by the empty cage, his face twisted with something between fury and humiliation. A few townspeople had gathered to watch, whispering behind their hands and shaking their heads. Let them whisper. Let them judge. For the first time in 3 days, Lila was free. The wagon rolled west out of town, following a dusty road that cut through open prairie. The sun was starting to sink toward the horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber. Lila sat in the back of the wagon, wrapped in the blanket despite the heat, too stunned to fully process what had just happened. The girls were watching her, not with suspicion or fear, but with curiosity. The youngest, who looked about 4 or 5, scooted closer and held out a piece of bread. "You can have more," she said. "Mama always said we should share." Lila took the bread carefully. "Thank you. What's your name?" "Grace." The little girl pointed at each of her sisters in turn. "That's Ruth, and that's Emma, and that's Clara, and that's Mary, and that's Papa. I'm Lila." "Are you going to live with us now?" Grace asked. "Grace, hush," Ruth said sharply. She was the oldest, the one with the dark braids, and she had the air of someone used to managing her younger sisters. "That's not our business." "I was just asking." "Well, don't." Lila glanced toward the front of the wagon where Reddick sat with his back to them, guiding the horses with steady hands. She wondered what he'd been thinking when he'd broken that lock. Wondered what kind of man saw a stranger in a cage and decided to risk the sheriff's wrath to set her free. "Your father is a good man," Lila said quietly. Ruth's expression softened. "He is. He's the best man I know." They rode in silence for a while, the wagon swaying gently over the uneven ground. Lila ate the bread slowly, savoring every bite. It was simple food, just bread and cheese and dried apples, but it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever had. As the sun dipped lower, Emma pulled a worn quilt from the wagon bed and spread it over the younger girls. Clara and Grace were already starting to doze off, their heads resting against Ruth's shoulders. Mary, who looked about 7, watched Lila with solemn eyes. "Miss Lila?" she said softly. "Yes?" "Were you scared?" "In the cage." Lila considered lying, but something about the girl's earnest face made her choose honesty instead. "I was, very scared." "I'm glad Papa got you out." "So am I." Mary nodded, satisfied, and then she too started to drift off to sleep. Ruth stayed awake, keeping watch over her sisters the way Lila imagined she always did. There was something achingly familiar about it, the way the oldest child became a second parent when the mother was gone. Lila had been that child once, before her own mother died and left her with nothing but grief and the open road. "How long has it been?" Lila asked quietly. "Since your mother passed?" Ruth didn't seem surprised by the question. 2 years, almost 3 now." "I'm sorry." "Thank you." Ruth pulled the quilt higher around Grace's shoulders. "Papa says she's watching over us. I don't know if that's true, but I like to think it is." They rode until full dark, the prairie stretching out endlessly on all sides. The stars came out one by one, bright and cold against the black sky. Lila had always loved the stars, loved the way they made the world feel both vast and intimate at the same time. Finally, Reddick pulled the wagon to a stop near a small creek. "We'll camp here tonight," he said. "Ruth, help me with the fire. Emma, you're on water duty." The girls moved with practiced efficiency, each one knowing exactly what to do. Within 20 minutes, they had a small fire crackling and a pot of beans warming over the flames. Reddick set up a canvas tent for the girls to sleep in, then spread out bedrolls near the fire. He handed Lila a tin plate with beans and cornbread. "It's not much," he said. "It's everything," Lila replied. They ate in comfortable silence, the fire popping and hissing between them. When the younger girls started yawning, Ruth herded them into the tent with gentle firmness. Soon, it was just Lila, Reddick, and the night. Lila set her empty plate aside and pulled the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "What you did back there—" "Don't." Reddick's voice was quiet but firm. "You don't owe me anything. I owe you my life. 3 more days in that cage and I would have—" She stopped, unable to finish the sentence. Reddick poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a shower of sparks. My wife used to say that kindness isn't a debt, it's just what we're supposed to do for each other. Your wife sounds like she was a good woman. She was the best woman I ever knew. His voice was rough with old grief. Her name was Mercy, and she lived up to it every day of her life. She would have done the same thing I did today, probably would have done it faster. Lila thought about that, about a woman named Mercy who had loved this quiet man and raised 5 daughters and believed in kindness even when the world was cruel. How did she die? She asked softly. Fever. Came on fast and took her in 3 days. Reddick's jaw tightened. I rode 15 miles for a doctor, but by the time we got back, she was already gone. Ruth found her in bed with Grace curled up next to her, both of them sleeping, except Mercy wasn't sleeping. I'm so sorry. He nodded but didn't say anything else. They sat in silence for a long time, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Reddick stood and handed Lila a bedroll. You can sleep by the fire. I'll keep watch. You don't have to. I'm not sleeping anyway, he said simply. Haven't slept well in years. Lila took the bedroll and spread it out near the warmth of the fire. She lay down and pulled the blanket over herself, but she didn't close her eyes. Instead, she watched Reddick as he settled onto a rock a few feet away, his rifle resting across his knees, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the firelight. She wondered what he was watching for. Wolves, outlaws, or just the ghosts of everything he'd lost. For the first time in years, Lila felt safe, not because of the fire or the food or the blanket, but because of the man sitting watch, a man who had looked at a stranger in a cage and seen someone worth saving. She closed her eyes and let sleep take her, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she slept without expecting a blow. Morning came with the smell of coffee and frying bacon. Lila woke to the sound of the girls' voices, soft and cheerful, and for a moment she forgot where she was. Then she opened her eyes and saw the sky above her, wide and blue and impossibly clear, and remembered. She sat up slowly, her body still stiff and sore from 3 days in the cage. Reddick was crouched by the fire, tending to a skillet while Ruth poured coffee into tin cups. The younger girls were already awake, splashing in the creek and giggling as they washed their faces. Morning, Reddick said without looking up. Coffee's hot if you want some. Lila stood and walked to the fire, accepting the cup Ruth handed her. The coffee was strong and bitter, but it was exactly what she needed. Thank you. Papa says we're going home today, Emma announced, appearing at Lila's side with damp hair and bright eyes. It's another half-day's ride, but Papa says we'll be there by supper. Home. The word sat heavy in Lila's chest. She'd been on the road for so long that she'd almost forgotten what home felt like. What will I do? She asked quietly, directing the question at Reddick. When we get there? He flipped the bacon in the skillet before answering. That depends. Can you work? I can do anything you need. Cook, clean, mend, tend animals, whatever you need. Then you'll work. I've got a ranch that's falling apart faster than I can fix it. 5 daughters who need looking after, and a house that hasn't been properly cleaned in 2 years. If you're willing to help, I'm willing to give you a place to stay. It wasn't charity. It was a trade, her labor for his protection. Lila felt something loosen in her chest, something that had been coiled tight for months. I'm willing, she said. Reddick nodded once, satisfied. Good. Eat up. We've got a long ride ahead. They broke camp quickly, loading the wagon and dousing the fire. The girls climbed into the back and Lila joined them, settling in among the quilts and bundles. Reddick took his place on the driver's seat and urged the horses forward. The morning was cool and pleasant, and as they rode, the girls began to sing old songs about rivers and mountains and cowboys riding under stars. Lila didn't know the words, but she hummed along anyway, and Grace clapped her hands in delight. You should sing louder, Miss Lila, she said. You have a pretty voice. I'm not sure about that, Lila said with a laugh. But thank you. They stopped once at midday to rest the horses and eat a quick meal of leftover cornbread and jerky. The girls ran off to explore a small grove of cottonwood trees while Reddick checked the wagon wheels and adjusted the harnesses. Lila sat in the shade and watched him work. He moved with the kind of quiet competence that came from years of hard labor. No wasted motion, no unnecessary words. She wondered what it would be like to live in his house, to work beside him, to share space with his daughters. The thought should have frightened her, but instead it felt like a door opening after being locked for too long. When they set out again, the landscape began to change. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with scrub brush and juniper trees. In the distance, Lila could see the shadow of mountains, their peaks still capped with snow even in late summer. "There," Ruth said, pointing ahead. "That's home." Lila followed her gaze and saw a ranch nestled in a shallow valley. There was a house, modest but solid, built from rough-hewn logs and topped with a shingled roof. Near it stood a barn that had seen better days, its red paint faded and peeling. Beyond that were corrals and outbuildings, a windmill turning slowly in the breeze, and fields that stretched toward the tree line. It wasn't much, but it was more than Lila had seen in years. As the wagon rolled closer, she could make out details. Laundry hanging on a line, chickens scratching in the dirt, a dog that came bounding out to greet them with enthusiastic barks. The girls called out to the dog, whose name was apparently Blue, and he ran alongside the wagon all the way to the house. Reddick pulled the wagon to a stop in front of the porch and climbed down. The girls scrambled out after him, and Blue launched himself at them with such force that Clara tumbled backward into the dirt, laughing. Lila stayed in the wagon, suddenly uncertain. This was their home, their life. She was just a stranger, a burden, someone who had nowhere else to go. But then Reddick appeared at the back of the wagon, reaching up to help her down. His hand was rough and calloused, but his grip was steady. "Welcome home," he said quietly, and for reasons she couldn't explain, Lila believed him. The house was smaller on the inside than it looked from the outside, but it was clean and well kept despite what Reddick had said about not having time. There was a main room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen area with a cast iron stove, and 2 small bedrooms in the back. The girls slept in one room, all 5 of them packed in like sardines, while Reddick took the other. "You can take the loft," Ruth said, pointing to a ladder that led to a small space above the main room. "Mama used to store quilts up there, but we moved them. There's a pallet and a blanket." Lila climbed the ladder and found exactly what Ruth had described. A narrow space under the eaves, just big enough for one person, with a thin pallet and a faded quilt. It wasn't much, but it was hers, private and safe. She came back down and found the girls already bustling around the kitchen. Ruth was pumping water into a kettle, Emma was stoking the stove, and Mary was setting the table with mismatched plates. Clara and Grace were supposed to be helping, but they were mostly just getting in the way. "What can I do?" Lila asked. Ruth glanced at her, then pointed to a basket of potatoes in the corner. "Those need peeling, and there's a chicken in the cold cellar that needs plucking." Lila nodded and got to work. It felt good to have something to do, to be useful instead of helpless. She peeled potatoes until her fingers were numb, then went out to the cold cellar, a small dugout behind the house, and retrieved the chicken. Plucking it was messy, unpleasant work, but she'd done it 100 times before and fell into the rhythm easily. By the time Reddick came in from tending the horses, the house smelled like roasting chicken and fresh bread. He stopped in the doorway and just stared for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Everything all right?" Lila asked. "Yeah," he said quietly. "Just been a while since it smelled like this in here." Dinner was simple but filling: roasted chicken, boiled potatoes, bread and butter, and canned peaches for dessert. The girls ate like they were starving, talking over each other and laughing at jokes Lila didn't quite understand. Reddick sat at the head of the table, quiet but present, and Lila sat at the other end, watching this strange, beautiful family that had taken her in without question. After dinner, the girls cleared the table while Lila washed the dishes. Ruth dried them and put them away, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd been doing this for years. "You're good with them," Ruth said suddenly. "The little ones, I mean." "I used to take care of my younger siblings," Lila said. "Before they—" She stopped, not wanting to finish that sentence. "Before they what?" Lila scrubbed at a stubborn spot on a plate. "Before they died. Fever took them. Took my mother, too. I was the only one left." Ruth was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I'm sorry. I didn't know." "How could you?" They finished the dishes in silence. When the last plate was dried and put away, Ruth called her sisters over and lined them up like soldiers. "Bath time," she announced. The younger girls groaned, but Ruth was unmoved. She heated water on the stove and filled a large tin tub in front of the fireplace, then supervised as each girl took her turn. Lila helped with the youngest ones, washing their hair and scrubbing behind their ears while they squirmed and complained. "You're worse than Ruth," Grace pouted. "Good," Lila said with a smile. "Then maybe you'll actually get clean." By the time the last girl was dried and dressed in her nightgown, it was late. Reddick sent them all to bed, and they went without much protest, their earlier energy finally spent. Ruth lingered in the doorway for a moment, then said goodnight and disappeared into the bedroom. Lila sat by the dying fire, staring into the embers. She was exhausted, but in a good way, the kind of tired that came from honest work instead of fear and desperation. Reddick came out of his room and sat in the chair across from her. For a while, neither of them spoke. Then he said, "You did good today." "I just did what needed doing." "That's more than most people would have done." He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I meant what I said earlier. You can stay as long as you need. Work for your keep, and you'll have a roof over your head and food in your belly. No questions asked." Lila looked at him, this quiet man who had saved her from a cage and asked for nothing in return. "Why are you doing this?" "Because someone should have done it for you a long time ago." He stood and picked up his rifle from where it leaned against the wall. "Get some rest. Morning comes early around here." He went out onto the porch, and Lila heard the creak of the rocking chair as he settled in for another sleepless night. She climbed the ladder to the loft and lay down on the pallet, pulling the quilt up to her chin. Through the small window above her head, she could see the stars, bright and endless and achingly beautiful. She thought about the cage in Sagebrush Hollow, the iron bars, and the jeering faces, and the crushing certainty that she would die there. She thought about Reddick's hand reaching through the bars with a canteen of water. She thought about Grace offering her bread, and Emma spreading a quilt over her shoulders, and Ruth teaching her where to find the cold cellar. For the first time in years, Lila let herself imagine a future. Not just survival, but something more. A place to belong, a family to care for. A reason to wake up in the morning that wasn't just fear. She closed her eyes and listened to the night sounds, the creak of the rocking chair on the porch, the distant howl of a coyote, the soft breathing of 5 little girls in the room below. And she slept. The first week passed in a blur of work and routine. Lila woke before dawn each morning to the sound of roosters crowing and Reddick's boots on the porch. She'd climb down from the loft, splash cold water on her face from the basin, and get the stove going while the girls still slept. By the time Ruth emerged to help with breakfast, the kitchen would already smell like coffee and frying bacon. Reddick never said much in the mornings. He'd come in from checking the animals, pour himself coffee, and sit at the table with his hands wrapped around the cup like he was trying to warm something deep inside that had gone cold years ago. Sometimes he'd glance at Lila as she moved around the kitchen, and she'd catch something in his eyes, surprise maybe, or gratitude, but he never put it into words. The girls opened up to her slowly, like flowers turning toward unexpected sun. Grace was the easiest, climbing into Lila's lap at every opportunity and declaring that Miss Lila smelled like bread and sunshine. Mary was quieter but just as affectionate, often appearing at Lila's elbow to help with whatever task was at hand. Clara hovered somewhere in between, testing boundaries with the careful curiosity of a 7-year-old who'd learned to be cautious about new people. Emma and Ruth were harder to reach. Emma had her mother's practical nature and didn't waste time on sentiment, though Lila noticed she always saved the best biscuits for Lila's plate. Ruth was the most guarded of all, watching, evaluating, protecting her sisters with fierce devotion. Lila understood. Ruth had been holding this family together, and she wasn't about to hand that responsibility over to a stranger without proof it was safe. So Lila worked. She mended torn sleeves and patched worn knees until her fingers ached. She scrubbed floors on her hands and knees, beat rugs until dust clouds filled the air, and washed mountains of laundry in the creek while the girls played nearby. She learned to milk the cow without getting kicked, to gather eggs without disturbing the broody hens, and to tell which chickens were worth keeping and which ones were destined for the soup pot. Reddick watched her work with the same quiet attention he gave everything else. Once, when she was hauling water from the well, he appeared beside her and took the bucket from her hands without a word. She'd started to protest, but he'd just shaken his head and carried it to the house himself. After that, he took over the heavy hauling, water, firewood, feed sacks, leaving her the countless other tasks that kept a household running. It was on the 8th day that Lila finally asked Ruth about their mother. They were in the garden pulling weeds, the afternoon sun hot on their backs. Ruth had been teaching her which plants to save and which to throw to the chickens, and they'd fallen into a comfortable rhythm. But Lila had been wondering about the woman who'd raised these girls, the woman whose absence still echoed through every corner of the house. "What was she like?" Lila asked, yanking up a stubborn thistle. "Your mother." Ruth didn't answer right away. She sat back on her heels and wiped dirt from her hands, her eyes distant. "She was kind. Not just nice, kind. There's a difference, you know? Nice is easy when everything's going well. Kind is when it costs you something and you do it anyway. Your father said her name was Mercy. It fit her." Ruth pulled another weed and tossed it in the bucket. "She used to say that everyone's carrying something heavy, even if you can't see it. So you should be gentle with people, just in case. Papa says I'm like her, but I don't think I am. I don't have her patience." Lila thought about that, about a woman named Mercy who had seen the weight people carried and chosen gentleness anyway. "I think you're more like her than you realize." Ruth looked at her sharply, then away. For a moment, Lila thought she'd overstepped. But then Ruth said quietly, "She would have liked you. Mama, I mean. She always said the best people were the ones who knew what it meant to need help." Something tightened in Lila's chest. She'd spent so long being ashamed of her poverty, her homelessness, her dependence on others. But here was this girl, this wise, weary 12-year-old, telling her that needing help wasn't weakness. It was just being human. "Thank you," Lila said softly. "That means more than you know." They finished the weeding in silence, but it was a different kind of silence than before. Easier, closer. That night, after the dishes were done and the girls were in bed, Lila found herself sitting by the fire with Reddick again. It had become a habit, the two of them keeping company in the quiet hours, not saying much but not needing to. He'd oil his rifle or sharpen tools while she mended clothes, and the only sounds would be the crackle of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl outside. But tonight, Reddick seemed restless. He kept glancing toward the window, his jaw tight with tension Lila couldn't quite name. "Everything all right?" she asked, setting down the shirt she was mending. "Letter came today," he said, not looking at her. "From town. Marshall rode out special to deliver it." Lila's stomach dropped. "What kind of letter?" "The kind that's looking for you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded piece of paper, yellowed and creased. "Man named Royce Mercer. Says you ran out on a contract with him. Says he's got legal claim to your labor and wants you returned." The name hit Lila like a fist. Royce Mercer. The man who'd bought her indenture contract from a factory owner in Omaha, who'd promised her honest work and fair wages and then locked her in a back room when she'd tried to leave. The man whose brother had cornered her in Sagebrush Hollow, whose lies had put her in that cage. "That's not true," she said, her voice shaking. "I never signed anything with him. He bought a contract that wasn't legal. I was never indentured, I was just desperate, and he took advantage. When I realized what he wanted, what he really wanted, I ran." "What did he want?" Lila looked down at her hands. "Things no woman should have to trade for food and shelter." Reddick's face went hard as stone. Without a word, he stood, walked to the fireplace, and dropped the letter into the flames. They both watched as the paper blackened and curled, the words dissolving into ash and smoke. "You're not going back," he said flatly. "Not to him. Not to anyone who treats you like property. He'll come for me. Men like Royce don't let go of what they think they own." "Then he'll learn different." Reddick turned to face her, and in the firelight his eyes were fierce. "You belong to yourself, Lila. Nobody else. Not Royce Mercer, not the law, not even me. You stay here because you choose to, and you leave when you choose to. That's how it works." Lila felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. "You don't know what he's like. I know exactly what he's like." Reddick's voice was low and certain. "I know his type. And I'm telling you right now, he sets foot on my land, he'll regret it." For the first time since she'd heard Royce's name, Lila felt something other than fear. She felt believed, protected, seen as more than just a problem or a burden. Thank you, she whispered. Reddick nodded once, then sat back down and picked up his rifle. Get some sleep. Morning comes early. But Lila didn't sleep well that night. She lay in the loft staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle around her, and thought about Royce Mercer. She remembered his smile. Too wide, too hungry. Remembered the way he'd looked at her like she was livestock he'd just purchased. Remembered the sound of the door locking behind her and the sick realization that she'd walked into a trap. She'd escaped once. But Royce was stubborn and cruel. And he didn't like losing. If he'd tracked her this far, he wouldn't stop until he either got her back or destroyed her trying. The next morning, Lila was quiet as she made breakfast. The girls sensed something was wrong and kept glancing at her with worried eyes. But they didn't ask questions. Even Grace, who usually chattered nonstop, ate her porridge in silence. Reddick finished his coffee and stood. Ruth, Emma, you're with me today. We're mending the north fence. Mary, Clara, Grace, stay close to the house. Lila, you stay inside. Don't go out to the barn or the well unless I'm with you. Ruth's eyes went wide. Papa, what's wrong? Nothing you need to worry about. Just do what I say. He left before anyone could argue, Ruth and Emma trailing after him with confused backward glances. The younger girls looked at Lila for explanation, but she just shook her head and started clearing the table. The day dragged. Lila kept herself busy with indoor tasks, baking bread, mending, sweeping, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to break. She kept glancing out the windows, half expecting to see Royce's face leering back at her. Around midday, Grace tugged on her skirt. Miss Lila, can we go to the creek? It's so hot. Not today, sweetheart. But why? Because your papa said to stay close. Grace pouted, but didn't push. She wandered off to play with her rag doll while Mary and Clara set up a game with wooden blocks on the floor. Lila tried to focus on her work, but her hands were shaking. It was late afternoon when she heard the horses. The sound came from the east, beyond the barn, hoofbeats on hard-packed earth, moving slow and deliberate. Lila's heart lurched into her throat. She moved to the window and peered through the gap in the curtains. 2 riders. She couldn't see their faces from this distance, but she knew. Somehow, she knew. Girls, she said, keeping her voice calm. Go to your room, right now, and don't come out until I tell you. Mary grabbed Grace's hand, and Clara gathered up the blocks without argument. They'd heard that tone before, the one that meant danger was close. They disappeared into the bedroom, and Lila heard the door close softly behind them. She moved to the gun rack by the door and hesitated. Reddick kept 2 rifles there, both loaded. She'd never shot a gun in her life, but she'd watched him clean them often enough. How hard could it be? She was reaching for one when the front door swung open and Reddick stepped inside, Ruth and Emma right behind him. His face was tight with controlled fury. They're here, he said. I know, I saw them. Take the girls out the back. There's a root cellar 50 yards behind the house, hidden in the trees. You know the one? Lila nodded. She'd found it while exploring the property, a small underground room used for storing vegetables in winter. Get in there and don't come out until I come for you. Jonah? Don't argue. Just go. Ruth was already moving, gathering her sisters from the bedroom. Emma grabbed a lantern and matches. Within moments, all 6 of them were slipping out the back door and running for the tree line. Lila looked back once and saw Reddick standing on the porch, rifle in hand, waiting. Then the trees swallowed them up and she had to focus on keeping the girls quiet and moving. The root cellar was exactly where she remembered. A wooden door set into the hillside covered with moss and dirt. Ruth yanked it open and ushered her sisters inside. The space was cramped and musty, smelling of earth and old potatoes, but it was hidden and safe. They huddled together in the darkness, Grace clinging to Lila with small, frightened hands. Mary was crying softly, and Clara's breathing was too fast. Emma lit the lantern, and pale yellow light filled the small space, pushing back some of the shadows. Papa will be okay, Ruth said firmly, though her voice shook. He always is. Who are those men? Mary whispered. Lila looked at Ruth, unsure how much to say. Ruth met her eyes and gave a small nod. Tell them the truth. They're bad men, Lila said quietly. They're looking for me. But your papa isn't going to let them take me. Why do they want you? Clara asked. Because they think I belong to them. But I don't. I don't belong to anyone. Grace squeezed her hand tighter. You belong to us." Lila's throat closed up. She pulled the little girl closer and pressed a kiss to her hair. "Yes," she whispered, "I do." They waited. Minutes stretched into hours, though it couldn't have been more than 20 minutes. Every sound made them flinch, the snap of a twig, the rustle of leaves, the distant call of a crow. Lila strained her ears, listening for gunshots, for shouts, for anything that would tell her what was happening. Then, finally, footsteps. Heavy boots on earth, moving toward them. Ruth raised the lantern high, ready to use it as a weapon if needed. Lila positioned herself in front of the girls, ready to fight with her bare hands if that's what it took. The cellar door swung open, and Reddick's face appeared, backlit by late afternoon sun. "It's done," he said. "You can come out." They climbed out one by one, the girls rushing to their father and clinging to him like he might disappear if they let go. He held them close, his big hands gentle on their backs, murmuring reassurances. Lila was the last one out. She looked at Reddick and saw blood on his knuckles, a fresh bruise blooming on his jaw. "What happened?" "They came to the fence line, said they had a legal right to you. I told them no court in the territory would uphold a contract obtained through coercion and fraud. They said they didn't need a court. That's when Royce's brother, Cal, tried to ride past me. I stopped him." "Did you?" "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're asking. But he won't be sitting a saddle comfortably for a while." Reddick's eyes were hard. "I told them if they come back, I won't be as gentle. And I told them I'm taking this to the territorial marshal, filing a formal complaint about their business practices. Men like that don't like official scrutiny." "They'll come back," Lila said. "Royce doesn't give up. He'll wait until you're not here, or then we'll be ready." Reddick glanced at his daughters, then back at Lila. "I'm not sending you away, and I'm not letting them take you. This is your home now, as long as you want it. We'll figure the rest out together." That night, after the girls were in bed and the house was quiet, Lila found Reddick sitting on the porch again. But this time, instead of his rifle, he held a small wooden box. He opened it when she sat down beside him, revealing a collection of carefully folded papers, a silver locket, and a pressed flower. "Mercy's things," he said quietly. "I keep them close. Reminds me of who she was, what she believed in." Lila didn't say anything, just waited. "She used to tell me that strength isn't about how hard you can hit. It's about how much you can endure and still choose kindness." He picked up the locket and opened it, revealing a tiny portrait of a woman with gentle eyes and a soft smile. "She would have fought for you too. Would have told me I did the right thing today." "Did you?" Lila asked. "Was it worth the risk? Worth putting your daughters in danger?" Reddick looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she'd never expected to see: respect. "You're part of this family now, whether you planned it or not. And we don't abandon family. Not for Royce Mercer. Not for anyone." Lila felt tears slip down her cheeks, hot and unexpected. She'd spent so long believing she had to earn love, had to prove she was worth keeping. But here was this man telling her that belonging wasn't something to be earned. It was something freely given. "I don't know what to say." "Don't say anything. Just stay." Reddick closed the locket and put it back in the box. "And tomorrow, we start teaching the girls how to shoot. If trouble comes again, we'll all be ready." The next 3 days were a strange mix of normal routine and constant vigilance. Reddick set up targets behind the barn and taught Ruth and Emma how to load, aim, and fire the rifle. Lila practiced too, her hands shaking the first time she pulled the trigger, but steadying with repetition. Even Mary got lessons in basic gun safety, though Reddick wouldn't let her shoot yet. "Knowledge is protection," he told them. "You don't have to like guns to respect what they can do." Lila threw herself into the work with renewed determination. She wasn't just earning her keep anymore. She was building something. A life. A future. A family that had chosen her as fiercely as she'd chosen them. On the 4th night after Royce's visit, Lila woke to the smell of smoke. At first she thought she was dreaming, but then she heard crackling, loud and close, and sat bolt upright in the loft. Orange light flickered through the gaps in the floorboards, and when she looked down, she saw flames licking at the base of the ladder. "Fire!" she screamed. "Jonah! Fire!" She heard him burst from his room, heard Ruth shriek, heard the younger girls start to cry. Lila scrambled to the edge of the loft and looked down. The fire was spreading fast, already blocking the ladder. Smoke filled the room, thick and choking. "The window!" Reddick shouted. "Lila, the window!" She turned and saw it. A small window at the back of the loft, barely big enough to squeeze through. She ran to it and forced it open, coughing as smoke poured in behind her. Below, she could see the roof of the back porch, maybe a 6-foot drop. "Jump!" Reddick yelled. "I'll catch the girls!" Lila didn't hesitate. She climbed through the window and dropped, landing hard on the porch roof and rolling. Pain shot through her ankle, but she forced herself up and looked back. Ruth was already handing Grace through the window to Reddick, who'd climbed up from outside. He passed Grace to Lila, then Mary, then Clara. Emma came last, and Ruth after her. "Go," Reddick ordered, shoving them toward the edge of the porch roof. "Get clear of the house." They jumped one by one, landing in the dirt and running. Lila grabbed Grace and Mary, making sure they stayed together. When she turned back, the house was fully engulfed, flames shooting through the roof and windows exploding from the heat. Reddick appeared beside her, soot-streaked and breathing hard. "Everyone here? Everyone safe?" Ruth did a quick head count. "We're all here, Papa." "The barn," Emma said suddenly, pointing. "Papa, look!" The barn was on fire too, not as badly as the house, but flames were visible through the hayloft window. "This wasn't an accident," Reddick said, his voice deadly calm. "Someone set this." And then they heard it. Horses. Coming from the south, moving fast. In the firelight, Lila saw 2 riders approaching, and her blood turned to ice. Royce Mercer and his brother Cal. They reined in their horses about 30 yards away, just beyond the reach of the firelight. Royce was grinning, his face twisted with cruel satisfaction. Cal sat beside him with a rifle across his saddle. "Told you I'd come back," Royce shouted. "Told you I don't let go of what's mine." Reddick stepped forward, positioning himself between the riders and his family. "You burned my home, endangered my children. That's attempted murder, Mercer." "That's justice," Royce spat. "You took what belonged to me, Reddick. Now I'm taking it back." "She's not property." "She is if I say she is." Royce's hand dropped to his gun. "Now send her out here or I start shooting, and I don't much care who gets hit." Reddick's hand moved to his own gun, but Lila knew what would happen if this turned into a gunfight. The girls were too close. Someone would die, and it might be one of them. She stepped out from behind Reddick before she could talk herself out of it. "I'll go." "No!" Ruth grabbed her arm. "Miss Lila, no!" "I have to," Lila said, gently pulling free. "He'll kill all of you if I don't." "Lila, don't!" Reddick said, his voice rough with something that might have been fear. "Don't you dare!" She looked at him and saw everything she was about to lose. Safety, family, home, the first real chance at happiness she'd had in years. But she also saw 5 little girls who deserved to grow up without more death haunting them. "I'm sorry," she whispered. She started walking toward Royce, her legs shaking but her back straight. She would not go to him crawling. If this was the end, she would meet it with dignity. But she'd only made it 3 steps when a gunshot cracked through the night. Lila hit the ground, covering her head with her hands. More shots followed, rapid fire, close together. She heard horses scream and men shout, and then suddenly there were more riders coming from the west, 6 or 7 of them, surrounding Royce and Cal with rifles drawn. "Drop your weapons," a voice commanded. "This is the territorial marshal. Drop them now." Through the chaos and smoke, Lila saw Royce and Cal throw their guns to the ground, their faces twisted with rage and disbelief. The marshal and his deputies moved in, surrounding them, securing them with practiced efficiency. Someone pulled Lila to her feet. Reddick, his face etched with relief and fury in equal measure. "Are you hurt?" No, How did they—" "I sent word 3 days ago," Reddick said. "Told the marshal everything. He must have been watching, waiting for them to make a move." The marshal rode up, a grizzled man with silver in his beard and cold eyes. "Jonah Reddick? That's me? These the men who've been threatening you and your family?" "They are. They burned my house and barn tonight. Tried to kidnap Lila Carver against her will." The marshal looked at Royce and Cal with disgust. "Well, They won't be bothering anyone for a good long while. Maybe ever, if the judge has any sense. He tipped his hat to Lila. Miss Carver, you'll need to come to town and testify. But you're safe now. These men won't touch you again. As the deputies led Royce and Cal away in irons, Royce twisted in his saddle and locked eyes with Lila. This isn't over, he snarled. Cal will— Shut up, one of the deputies said, and cracked him across the back of the head with a rifle butt. They disappeared into the darkness, and suddenly it was just Lila, Reddick, and the girls, standing in the firelight watching their home burn. The house was gone, nothing left but blackened timbers and ash. The barn was still salvageable, barely, but most of their winter stores were destroyed. Grace started to cry, and then Clara joined her, and soon all the younger girls were sobbing. Ruth stood rigid and silent, her face pale in the flickering light. Emma had her arm around Mary, holding her close. Reddick gathered them all together, all 6 of them, and held them while they cried. And Lila, standing at the edge of their grief, finally understood what family meant. It wasn't walls and a roof, it wasn't safety or comfort or even a place to sleep. It was this: people who stood together when everything burned, people who fought for each other, people who didn't let go, even when the world tried to tear them apart. We'll rebuild, Reddick said into the smoke-filled night. We've lost the house, but we haven't lost each other, and that's what matters. Lila looked at the ruins of what had almost been her home, and then at the man and his daughters who'd given her something more valuable than shelter. They'd given her belonging, purpose, a reason to keep fighting. Yes, she said quietly, we will. The marshal's deputies stayed until dawn, helping to douse the last of the flames and making sure the fire didn't spread to the surrounding grassland. By the time the sun came up, the house was nothing but a smoking skeleton of blackened timber and collapsed roof beams. The barn had fared slightly better. One wall and most of the structure still stood, though the hayloft was gone and everything inside reeked of smoke and char. Reddick stood in front of what used to be his home, his daughters clustered around him like chicks around a hen. Grace had cried herself to sleep in his arms hours ago, and Ruth held her now, swaying slightly with exhaustion. The other girls were quiet, their faces streaked with soot and tears, their eyes hollow with shock. Lila watched them from a few feet away, her heart breaking for what she'd brought down on this family. If she'd never come here, if Reddick had just left her in that cage in Sagebrush Hollow, these children would still have a home. They'd still have their mother's quilts and their father's books, and the rocking chair where Mercy used to sing them to sleep. Stop it, Reddick said without looking at her. Lila startled. Stop what? Blaming yourself. I can see it all over your face. He finally turned to meet her eyes, and his expression was fierce. This wasn't your fault. This was Royce Mercer's doing, and his alone. You didn't light those fires. You didn't threaten my family. All you did was exist, and that's not a crime. But if you hadn't been here, we wouldn't have known what kind of man Mercer was until it was too late. If you hadn't been here, my daughters wouldn't have learned what it means to stand up for someone who needs help. If you hadn't been here, his voice cracked, just slightly. If you hadn't been here, this house would still be empty, and I'd still be just going through the motions of living. So don't you dare apologize for surviving. The marshal approached before Lila could respond, his hat in his hands. Reddick, you and your family can't stay here, not tonight. Not until we're sure Mercer didn't have any other associates lurking around. I've got nowhere else to go, Reddick said flatly. Actually, you do. The marshal gestured toward one of his deputies, a younger man with kind eyes and a generous smile. This is Deputy Frank Morrison. He and his wife have a place about 5 miles west. They've got room for all of you, at least until we get this sorted. Frank stepped forward and extended his hand. It's not much, but it's dry and safe. My wife Ellen will have breakfast ready by the time we get there, and she's been wanting company. We lost our own children to scarlet fever 3 years back, so she'll be happy to have little ones around again. Reddick hesitated, pride warring with practicality. Lila knew how hard it was for him to accept help, to admit he couldn't handle this alone. But then Emma tugged on his sleeve and whispered, Papa, I'm so tired. And something in him softened. All right, he said, we'll take you up on that, but just for a few days until I can figure out what comes next. Take as long as you need, Frank said. Ellen means it about wanting company. They gathered what little they could salvage from the ruins, A few blankets that had been hanging on the line behind the house, some tools from the barn, the tin box with Mercy's things that Reddick had managed to grab before the fire consumed his bedroom. Everything else was gone. Clothes, furniture, keepsakes, the life they'd built over years of hard work and love, all reduced to ash and memory. The ride to the Morrison place was quiet. The girls dozed in the back of Frank's wagon, too exhausted to stay awake despite the rough road. Reddick rode alongside on his horse with Ruth behind him, and Lila sat up front with Frank, watching the sun climb higher into a sky that seemed too blue and peaceful for what they'd just endured. "You're the one Mercer was after," Frank said quietly. It wasn't a question. "Yes." "Takes guts to stay when running would have been easier." Lila shook her head. "I tried to run. Would have gone with him if the marshal hadn't shown up." "But you didn't want to. That's what matters." Frank glanced at her, his expression thoughtful. "I've known Jonah Reddick for 10 years. Known him since before Mercy died. He's a good man, one of the best, but he's been hollowed out since we lost her. These past few weeks, though, folks in town have noticed a change. Said he seems more present, more himself. Ellen thinks it's because of you. I'm just the hired help." "You're more than that, and you know it," Frank smiled. "Those girls look at you like you hung the moon, and Jonah, well, he looks at you like a man who's remembering what it feels like to hope." Lila didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. But she thought about the way Reddick had stood between her and Royce, the way he'd burned that threatening letter without hesitation, the way he'd told her she belonged to herself and no one else. She thought about Grace calling her name in the night, and Ruth teaching her which weeds to pull, and Emma saving her the best biscuits. Maybe Frank was right. Maybe she was more than hired help. Maybe she was becoming something she'd never dared imagine, someone who belonged. The Morrison place was smaller than Reddick's ranch had been, but it was neat and well-maintained. The house was a simple structure of whitewashed wood with a wide front porch and blue shutters on the windows. A vegetable garden flourished behind a white picket fence, and chickens scratched contentedly in the yard. Ellen Morrison came out to meet them before the wagon had even fully stopped. She was a plump woman with graying blonde hair and a smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. When she saw the soot-streaked children, her face crumpled with sympathy. "Oh, you poor darlings," she said, already reaching for Grace. "Come inside, all of you. I've got hot water for washing and food on the stove." The next few hours passed in a blur of kindness. Ellen fed them eggs and bacon and fresh bread with butter, then heated water for baths and found clean clothes for everyone to wear. The clothes didn't fit quite right. The girls swam in dresses that had been meant for children long gone, and Lila wore one of Ellen's old work dresses that was too short and too wide. But they were clean and they didn't smell like smoke, and that was enough. Reddick tried to help, but Ellen shooed him away and told him to rest. He ended up sitting on the porch with Frank, smoking a pipe and staring at nothing. Lila could see the weight of responsibility crushing down on him. 7 people depending on him, and he'd just lost everything he'd spent years building. By midday, the younger girls had fallen asleep in Ellen's spare bedroom, curled up together like puppies. Ruth and Emma sat at the kitchen table with Ellen, learning how to make apple preserves. Lila found herself at loose ends, so she went out to the porch where Reddick still sat. He looked up when she approached, then scooted over to make room on the bench. They sat in silence for a while, listening to the sound of Ellen's laughter drifting through the open kitchen window. "I need to go into town tomorrow," Reddick said finally. "Talk to the bank, see if I can get a loan to rebuild. Talk to the marshal about testifying against Mercer. Figure out where we go from here." "What if the bank says no?" "Then we'll figure something else out." He rubbed his face with both hands. "I've got some savings, enough to buy lumber and supplies if I do most of the work myself. It'll take time, but we can rebuild. We have to." Lila thought about the years it would take to reconstruct what had been lost in a single night. The endless days of sawing and hammering and hauling, the winters they'd spend cramped in whatever shelter they could find, while Reddick worked himself to exhaustion trying to give his daughters a home again. "There might be another way," she said slowly. Reddick looked at her. "What do you mean?" "You said you have a friend, Elias Ward. The one who wrote you last spring asking if you'd consider moving west to help him start a new settlement." "I remember." "What if this is the sign you needed? What if instead of rebuilding on land where Royce Mercer's memory will haunt us, you take Elias up on his offer? Start fresh somewhere new, somewhere safe. Reddick was quiet for a long time. You think we should run. I think we should choose life over stubbornness. Lila turned to face him fully. Your daughters nearly died last night. So did you. And even with Royce in jail, his brother Cal got away. The marshal said so himself. Cal wasn't caught. He disappeared into the hills. What happens when Cal decides to finish what they started? What happens when another man like Royce comes along and sees 5 girls and a woman with a price on her head? There's no price on your head. You know what I mean. We'll always be looking over our shoulders here, always waiting for the next threat. She reached out and touched his hand, the first time she'd initiated contact between them. But if we go somewhere new, somewhere nobody knows us or our history, we could just be a family. No cages, no fires, no fear. Just land and work and peace. Reddick looked down at their joined hands. You said we. You planning on coming with us? If you'll have me. You don't have to tie yourself to us, Lila. You're free now. Mercer's in jail. His claims are worthless. You could go anywhere, do anything. I know. Lila squeezed his hand gently. And I choose this. I choose you and your daughters and whatever comes next, if that's all right with you. Something shifted in Reddick's expression, the walls he'd built around his grief and loneliness cracking just enough to let light in. It's more than all right, he said quietly. It's what I've been hoping for since the day I pulled you out of that cage. That night, after the girls were asleep and Ellen and Frank had retired to their own room, Lila and Reddick sat at the kitchen table with maps spread out before them. Elias Ward's last letter was pinned under a coffee cup, the words promising good land, fair prices, and a community built on mutual support rather than exploitation. It's 2 weeks of hard travel, Reddick said, tracing the route with his finger. Through some rough country. We'd need to outfit a wagon, buy supplies, make sure the girls are prepared for the journey. How much would it cost? More than I have, but less than rebuilding. If I sell the land here, that should cover it. He looked up at her. You're sure about this? Once we start, there's no going back. I've never been more sure of anything. And it was true. For the first time in her life, Lila wasn't running away from something. She was running toward it, toward possibility, toward family, toward a future that didn't include cages and shame and endless fear. They stayed with the Morrisons for 3 more days while Reddick made arrangements. He rode into town each morning and returned each evening with updates. The bank had agreed to buy his land at a fair price, enough to fund their journey and leave a little cushion for emergencies. The territorial judge had set a trial date for Royce Mercer, assault, arson, attempted kidnapping. The marshal assured them that Royce would hang, or at the very least spend the rest of his life behind bars. But Cal was still out there, still free, still dangerous. On the 3rd night, after the girls had gone to bed, there was a knock at the door. Frank answered it and stepped back with a grim expression. Jonah, you'd better see this. Lila followed Reddick to the door and felt her blood turn to ice. Pinned to the door frame with a hunting knife was a piece of paper. The message was short and written in crude block letters. You took my brother, I'll take everything you love. Frank pulled the knife free and crumpled the note in his fist. That son of a... He was here, Ellen said from behind them, her face pale. He knows where we are. He knows where the children are sleeping. Reddick's jaw was tight enough to shatter stone. We leave tomorrow. First light. Jonah, you're not ready, Frank protested. You haven't finished outfitting. We'll buy what we need on the road. I'm not staying here another night knowing Cal Mercer is circling like a wolf. He turned to Lila. Wake the girls. Pack whatever Ellen can spare. We're going. The next few hours were chaos. Ellen filled their arms with food and blankets while Frank helped Reddick prepare the wagon. The girls woke confused and frightened, but Ruth kept them calm with the steady competence she'd inherited from her mother. By the time the first gray light of dawn touched the horizon, they were ready to go. Ellen hugged each of the girls goodbye, tears streaming down her face. You write to me, she told Ruth. Let me know you're safe. I will, Ruth promised. Thank you for everything. Frank handed Reddick a rifle and a box of ammunition. Extra protection. And here, he pressed a folded paper into Reddick's hand. Money. Don't argue. You'll need it more than we do." Reddick tried to protest, but Frank cut him off. Mercy was Ellen's closest friend. Helped her through the worst time of our lives. Let us help you now. It's what she would have wanted. Finally, Reddick nodded and pocketed the money. "I'll pay you back." "I know you will." They climbed into the wagon, Reddick driving, Ruth beside him, the younger girls and Lila in the back. As they pulled away from the Morrison place, Lila looked back and saw Ellen and Frank standing in the doorway, waving goodbye. She wondered if they'd ever see them again. The first 2 days of travel were uneventful but exhausting. They followed old trading routes through rolling prairie, stopping only to rest the horses and eat quick meals of jerky and hardtack. The girls entertained themselves with songs and games, but Lila could see the fear underneath their brave faces. Every time a bird startled from the brush, they flinched. Every time hoofbeats echoed in the distance, they went silent. On the third day, they reached a small settlement called Cedar Ridge. It was barely more than a trading post, a blacksmith shop, and a handful of houses, but it had what they needed, supplies and a place to rest. Reddick negotiated with the trading post owner while Lila took the girls to the creek to wash up. They were heading back to the wagon when Grace suddenly grabbed Lila's hand and pointed. "Miss Lila, that man is watching us." Lila looked where Grace was pointing and saw a figure standing in the shadow of the blacksmith shop. Even from a distance, she recognized the stance, the build. Cal Mercer. "Girls, get to your father," Lila said, keeping her voice calm. "Right now. Walk. Don't run." Ruth immediately understood. She gathered her sisters and moved toward the trading post, glancing back once with wide, terrified eyes. Lila followed more slowly, keeping herself between the girls and Cal, her heart hammering against her ribs. Cal stepped out of the shadows, and Lila got her first clear look at him. He was younger than Royce, maybe 30, with hard eyes and a cruel slash of a mouth. A bruise darkened one side of his face, probably from where Reddick had hit him during their first confrontation. "You cost me my brother," Cal said, his voice carrying across the distance. "Cost me my business, my reputation, everything. And you think you can just leave? Think you can run far enough that I won't find you?" Lila forced herself to keep walking. "Your brother cost himself everything. What he did was illegal and wrong, and he's paying for it. He was trying to collect what was rightfully his. I was never his. I'm not property." Cal's hand dropped to his gun, and Lila's breath caught. She was maybe 20 feet from the trading post, but that suddenly felt like 20 miles. She could see Reddick inside, his back turned, unaware of the danger. "Lila Carver," Cal said, almost conversationally. "That's your name, right? Funny thing is, I've been asking around about you. Found out some interesting things. Found out you've got quite a past. Found out there are other folks who might be interested in knowing where you are." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you?" Cal smiled, and it was the ugliest expression Lila had ever seen. "Maybe you'll remember better after we have a private conversation, just you and me. No Reddick to protect you this time." He started walking toward her, his hand still on his gun. Lila knew she should run, should scream for help, but her legs wouldn't move. It was like being back in that cage in Sagebrush Hollow, frozen with fear and certainty that this was how it would end. But then a small voice rang out, high and clear in the afternoon air. "You leave Miss Lila alone!" Grace had broken away from Ruth and was running toward Cal with her small fists clenched. Emma was right behind her, and then Mary, and then Clara. Even Ruth was moving forward, her face set with determination. "You girls get back," Cal snarled. "This doesn't concern you." "Yes, it does," Grace shouted. "Miss Lila is ours. You can't have her." And then Reddick was there, moving faster than Lila had ever seen him move. He positioned himself between Cal and the girls, his rifle raised and aimed at Cal's chest. "Touch any of them, and I'll kill you where you stand." Cal's eyes darted between Reddick, the gun, and the girls. "You won't shoot me in front of your daughters. Try me." For a long moment, nobody moved. The whole settlement seemed to be holding its breath, waiting to see what would happen. Then the trading post owner appeared with his own shotgun, followed by the blacksmith and 2 other men Lila didn't recognize. "We don't tolerate threats here," the trading post owner said. "Move along, mister, or we'll make you move." Cal looked at the assembled men, at Reddick's unwavering aim, at the girls clustered behind their father like a fortress of defiance. Finally, he stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "This isn't over," he said to Lila. "I'll find you. Doesn't matter how far you run, I'll find you. And when you do, I'll be ready," Reddick interrupted. "And next time, there won't be witnesses to stop me from doing what needs doing." Cal spat in the dirt, then turned and walked away. They watched until he disappeared around the corner of the blacksmith's shop, and then they heard the sound of a horse galloping out of town. Lila's legs finally gave out, and she sat down hard in the dusty street. Grace immediately threw herself into Lila's lap, wrapping small arms around her neck. "I won't let him take you, Miss Lila. I won't." "I know, sweetheart. Thank you for being so brave." Reddick helped her to her feet, his hands gentle despite the fury still burning in his eyes. "We're leaving, right now. I don't care if we have to travel all night. We're putting distance between us and that man." They finished gathering supplies in record time and were back on the road within the hour. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Lila looked back one last time at Cedar Ridge and thought about Cal's threat. He would follow them. She knew that now with absolute certainty. Men like Cal didn't forgive, didn't forget, didn't stop until they got what they wanted or died trying. But she also knew something else. She wasn't alone anymore. She had Reddick, who stood between her and danger without hesitation. She had Ruth and Emma, who moved toward trouble instead of away from it. She had Grace and Mary and Clara, who shouted defiance at armed men because they believed she was worth protecting. Whatever came next, whatever battles they still had to fight, they would face them together, and that made all the difference. Night fell as they traveled, and Reddick finally allowed them to stop in a protected hollow between two hills. They made a cold camp, no fire that might give away their position, and huddled together for warmth. The girls fell asleep quickly, exhausted from fear and travel, but Lila stayed awake with Reddick, keeping watch. "You should rest," he said quietly. "I'll keep watch." "I can't sleep. Every time I close my eyes, I see Cal's face." She pulled her borrowed shawl tighter around her shoulders. "I'm sorry, Jonah. I'm so sorry I brought this down on you and your family." "Stop apologizing for existing." His voice was firm but not unkind. "Cal Mercer is responsible for Cal Mercer's choices, not you. And we're going to get through this, all of us, because that's what families do." Lila looked at him in the starlight, this man who'd become more than just her rescuer or her employer. Somewhere along the way, he'd become her anchor, her safe harbor, the first person in years who'd made her believe she deserved safety and kindness and belonging. "When did I become family?" she asked softly. Reddick was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "The moment you stepped out of that wagon and asked what you could do to help, the moment you mended Grace's torn sleeve and sang Mary to sleep and taught Ruth that needing help wasn't weakness, the moment you chose to stay even when staying meant danger." He reached out and took her hand, the gesture tender and deliberate. "You've been family since the beginning, Lila. We just needed time to catch up to what our hearts already knew." Tears slipped down Lila's cheeks, but for once they weren't tears of grief or fear. They were tears of gratitude, of relief, of overwhelming emotion that came from finally, being seen and valued for who she was instead of what she could provide. "I choose this," she said. "I choose all of you, no matter what comes next. Then we'll face it together." Reddick squeezed her hand gently. "And tomorrow, we keep moving west, toward Elias Ward's valley, toward a new start, toward home." They sat together in the darkness, hands joined, watching over 5 sleeping girls and dreaming of a future where fear was just a memory, and family was the only fortress they'd ever need. They traveled for 8 more days, pushing west through territory that grew more rugged with each passing mile. The prairie gave way to foothills, and the foothills climbed toward mountains whose peaks still wore crowns of snow despite the summer heat. The girls grew quiet as the landscape changed, their earlier songs replaced by watchful silence. Even Grace stopped chattering, content to sit pressed against Lila's side with her thumb in her mouth, a habit Ruth said she'd given up 2 years ago. Every night, Reddick circled the camp before allowing anyone to sleep, his rifle always within reach. Every morning, he studied their back trail for signs of pursuit. Lila knew he was looking for Cal, waiting for the attack he was certain would come. The tension wore on all of them, turning simple tasks into exercises in vigilance. On the 9th day, they crested a ridge and saw smoke rising from a valley below. Not the black smoke of destruction, but the gentle gray of cook fires and hearth smoke, the sign of human habitation. Reddick pulled the wagon to a stop and studied the settlement with careful eyes. "That's it," he said. "That's Ward's Valley." Elias said they'd built near the confluence of 2 creeks, with mountains on 3 sides for protection. This matches his description exactly. Ruth stood up in the wagon bed to get a better look. "It's smaller than I thought it would be." "It's a new settlement. Maybe 50 families," Elias said. "But they're good people, hard-working folks looking to build something lasting." Reddick glanced back at his daughters and then at Lila. "Last chance to change your mind. Once we go down there, we're committed. This becomes home, for better or worse." "Better," Grace said firmly. "It's going to be better, Papa." Reddick smiled, the first genuine smile Lila had seen on his face in days. "All right then. Let's go home." The descent into the valley took another hour, the wagon creaking and swaying on the rough track. As they drew closer, Lila could make out details. Neat rows of cabins, a large building that might be a church or a community hall, fields already planted with late-season crops, livestock grazing in fenced pastures. Children played in the dirt streets, and women hung laundry while men worked on construction projects or tended animals. It looked peaceful, normal, like the kind of place where people grew old and raised families and didn't spend every night watching for threats in the darkness. They'd barely entered the settlement when a man came striding toward them, tall and broad-shouldered with a wild red beard and a smile that split his face like sunrise. "Jonah Reddick, you old son of a gun! You actually came!" Reddick jumped down from the wagon and clasped the man's hand. "Elias Ward, you silver-tongued devil! You made this sound so good I couldn't resist. And you brought the girls! Ruth, Emma, look how you've grown!" Elias peered into the wagon, his eyes twinkling. "And 3 more besides. Jonah, you've been busy." He stopped when he saw Lila, confusion flickering across his face. "This is Lila Carver," Reddick said, and there was something in his voice, possession or pride or protection, Lila couldn't quite tell. "She's part of the family now." Elias's eyebrows climbed toward his hairline, but he was too polite to ask the obvious questions. Instead, he doffed his hat to Lila and said, "Welcome to Ward's Valley, Miss Carver. Any friend of Jonah's is family to us." "Thank you," Lila said, climbing down from the wagon. "It's a beautiful place you've built here. We're trying. It's hard work starting from nothing, but we're making progress." Elias gestured toward the settlement. "Come on, I'll show you around. We've got a cabin set aside for new arrivals. Nothing fancy, but it's got a roof and a stove and room enough for all of you until you build your own place." As they walked through the settlement, people came out to greet them. A young woman named Sarah, who smiled shyly at Ruth. An older couple, the Hendersons, who immediately invited them to Sunday dinner. A blacksmith named Tom, who promised to help Reddick with whatever he needed. A schoolteacher named Miss Adelaide, who told the girls she'd be delighted to have new students. Everyone was warm and welcoming, but Lila saw the curiosity in their eyes when they looked at her. She knew what they were wondering. Who was she to this family? Wife? Sister? Hired help? The hired help didn't usually travel with a man and his daughters, didn't stand so close or look so comfortable in their presence. The cabin Elias had mentioned was at the edge of the settlement, nestled against the tree line with a view of the creek. It was small, just 2 rooms and a loft, but it was solidly built and blessedly empty. No ghosts of previous owners, no memories of loss. Just clean space waiting to be filled. "It's not much," Elias apologized, "but it's yours for as long as you need it. Once you pick your land and start building, you can use this as storage or let another family use it." "It's perfect," Reddick said. "Better than perfect. Thank you, Elias." "Don't thank me yet. Wait until you see the work ahead of you." Elias clapped him on the shoulder. "But we'll help. That's how we do things here. Everyone pitches in. Your barn raising will be next month, soon as we finish the Johnsons' house. In the meantime, you'll need to clear land, dig a well, set posts for fencing. It's a lot, but you're not doing it alone." After Elias left, they stood in the empty cabin and looked at each other. For the first time in 2 weeks, they were inside walls with a door that locked. They were safe. Grace broke the silence by running into the middle of the room and spinning in circles, her arms spread wide. I like it. It smells like pine trees and new wood. It's smaller than our old house, Clara observed, but she didn't sound disappointed, just thoughtful. We'll make it work, Ruth said, already taking inventory of what they'd need. Papa, there's no furniture. We'll need beds, a table, chairs. I know. I'll talk to Tom the blacksmith tomorrow, see if he knows anyone selling furniture, and we've got bedrolls for now. Reddick set down the box containing Mercy's things, handling it with the reverence it deserved. Tonight, we rest. Tomorrow, we start building our new life. That night, they spread their bedrolls on the wooden floor and slept in a tight cluster. The girls in one room and Reddick and Lila in the other, a respectable distance between them but close enough that she could hear him breathing. For the first time since the fire, Lila slept through the night without jerking awake at every sound. Morning came with birdsong and sunlight streaming through the windows. The girls woke slowly, stretching and yawning, and for a moment they looked almost peaceful. Then Mary sat up and said, "Papa, I'm hungry. What's for breakfast?" It was a good question. They'd eaten the last of their supplies yesterday. Reddick stood and checked his pockets, pulling out a few crumpled bills and some coins. "I'll go see if there's a store. Buy some basics to get us through the week." "I'll come with you," Lila said. "I can help carry things." They walked through the settlement together, the morning air cool and crisp. People were already up and working, men heading to the fields, women starting laundry, children doing chores. Everyone they passed greeted them by name, a reminder that news traveled fast in small communities. The store was in the community hall, a simple affair with shelves stocked with flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and other staples. The storekeeper was a thin woman with sharp eyes and a sharper tongue, but she was fair with her prices. Reddick bought what they needed and paid with most of his remaining cash. As they were leaving, a woman approached them, late 30s with kind eyes and calloused hands. "Mr. Reddick, I'm Margaret Foster. I heard you arrived yesterday. I wanted to offer, well, I have some extra furniture in my barn. My husband passed last year and I don't need two of everything. If you'd like, you can have it. A table, some chairs, a bed frame or two. Nothing fancy, but serviceable." Reddick hesitated, and Lila could see him struggling again with pride. But then she touched his arm gently and said, "That's very kind of you, Mrs. Foster. We'd be grateful." Margaret smiled. "Wonderful. My son can help you haul it over this afternoon. And Miss Carver," she turned to Lila with understanding in her eyes, "if you need anything, clothes or kitchen goods or just someone to talk to, my door is always open. I know what it's like to start over with nothing." After Margaret left, Reddick was quiet. Finally he said, "I'm not used to this. People helping without asking for anything in return." "Maybe that's what makes this place different," Lila said. "Maybe that's why Elias wanted you here. Because here, you don't have to do everything alone." They spent the next 2 weeks settling in and learning the rhythms of Ward's Valley. Reddick met with Elias and the settlement council to choose his land, 100 acres on the north side of the valley, near good water and timber. The soil was rocky but workable, and there was a natural clearing perfect for building. In exchange for the land, he agreed to help with community projects, barn raisings, road maintenance, whatever was needed. The girls adapted quickly. Ruth and Emma enrolled in Miss Adelaide's school and immediately made friends with the other children. Mary, Clara, and Grace were still too young for formal schooling, but they tagged along anyway, learning their letters and playing games during breaks. Grace declared that she loved her new school almost as much as she loved Miss Lila, which made everyone laugh. Lila found her own place in the community. She helped Margaret Foster with her garden and learned that the older woman had lost her husband to a logging accident, leaving her alone with a teenage son to raise. She joined the other women for quilting circles and Sunday dinners, absorbing their stories and slowly sharing bits of her own. She was careful never to mention Royce or Cal Mercer, never to speak of the cage or the fire or the threats that had driven them here. As far as Ward's Valley was concerned, she was simply a woman traveling with the Reddick family, helping with the children. But at night, alone in the cabin, she and Reddick would sit by the small stove and talk quietly while the girls slept. They talked about their plans for the land, about what crops to plant and where to build the house. They talked about the girls and their futures, about making sure Ruth had a chance at something beyond endless housework. about teaching Emma to read maps and numbers, about letting the younger ones keep their childhood a little longer. And sometimes, when the conversation lulled, Reddick would tell her about Mercy, about the way she laughed at his terrible jokes, about how she'd sing while she worked, about the fierce love she'd had for their daughters and for him. Lila learned to hear these stories without jealousy, understanding that Mercy wasn't her rival, but rather the foundation on which this family was built. Reddick wasn't letting go of his first love. He was making room for something new alongside it. 3 weeks after their arrival, the peace shattered. Leela was at the creek washing clothes with several other women when she heard someone scream. She looked up to see a man on horseback riding hard into the settlement, and even from a distance, she recognized him. Cal Mercer. Her blood turned to ice. She dropped the wet shirt she'd been wringing out and ran. Her skirts hiked up around her knees, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. She had to get to the cabin, had to get to the girls. But Cal was faster. He'd already dismounted and was striding toward the school, where Miss Adelaide had just dismissed the children for their midday meal. Ruth and Emma were coming out the door, laughing about something, completely unaware of the danger. "Emma!" Lila screamed. "Ruth, run!" Ruth looked up and saw Cal. Her face went white, but she didn't run. Instead, she grabbed Emma's hand and started backing toward the schoolhouse door, calling for Miss Adelaide. Cal lunged forward and caught Emma by the arm, yanking her away from Ruth with such force that the girl cried out in pain. He pulled her against his chest and pressed a gun to her shoulder, the barrel cold against her skin. "Nobody move!" Cal shouted. "Nobody move or the girl dies!" The settlement froze. Women stopped mid-step. Men working on a nearby cabin set down their tools. Even the children stood still, their eyes wide with terror. Lila pushed through the gathering crowd, her vision tunneling until all she could see was Emma's frightened face and Cal's finger on the trigger. "Let her go, please. She's just a child." "She's leverage." Cal's eyes were wild, darting from face to face until they landed on Lila. "There you are. I knew you'd come out if I made enough noise. You know what you need to do, Lila. Come with me right now, peaceful-like, and I let the girl go. You run or make trouble, and I pull this trigger. Her blood will be on your hands." "Don't do it, Miss Lila," Emma cried out, tears streaming down her face. "Don't go with him." "Shut up," Cal snarled, pressing the gun harder against her shoulder. Emma whimpered but fell silent. Lila took a step forward, then another. She could feel everyone watching, could hear Ruth sobbing somewhere behind her, could sense the rage rolling off the gathered men like heat waves. But none of that mattered. All that mattered was Emma's life. "All right," she said, her voice surprisingly steady. "All right, I'll come. Just let her go first, please." "You think I'm stupid? You come here first, let me get a good hold on you, then I'll release the girl." Lila took another step. She was maybe 10 feet away now, close enough to see the sweat beading on Cal's forehead, close enough to smell the whiskey on his breath. This man was drunk and desperate, a terrible combination. If she made the wrong move, he'd kill Emma without hesitation. "Lila, don't!" The voice came from behind her, rough with emotion. "Reddick, don't you dare give yourself to him." "I have to," she said without turning around. "He has Emma. And if you go with him, he'll kill you. You know he will. This isn't about justice or contracts. This is about revenge." "I know." Lila's eyes were locked on Emma's tear-streaked face. "But I can't let him hurt her. I won't." She started to take another step, but Reddick's hand closed around her wrist, stopping her. He moved to stand beside her, and when she looked at him, she saw something in his eyes that made her breath catch. Not just fear or anger, but something deeper, something that looked almost like love. "You're not doing this alone," he said quietly. "Whatever happens next, we're in it together. You hear me?" Before Lila could respond, Cal's voice cut through the moment. "Enough talking! Lila, get over here now or I start shooting." "All right." Lila pulled free from Reddick's grip and walked forward, her hands raised, her heart breaking with every step. When she was close enough, Cal reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. He shoved Emma away roughly, sending her stumbling toward the crowd. Ruth caught her sister and held her tight, both girls sobbing. Cal pressed the gun against Lila's ribs now, his arm locked around her waist. "Everyone stays back. I'm taking her and leaving, and if anyone follows, I'll kill her. You understand?" No one answered. The crowd just stood there, frozen with helpless rage and fear. Cal started backing toward his horse, dragging Lila with him. She didn't struggle. There was no point. The gun was pressed too close, his grip too tight. But as they moved, she caught Reddick's eyes one last time and tried to tell him everything she'd never said out loud. That she loved his daughters like they were her own. That she was grateful for every moment he'd given her. That he'd saved her in more ways than just breaking open that cage. They were almost to the horse when a voice rang out, small but fierce. "You let Miss Lila go." Grace, tiny Grace, who was supposed to be napping in the cabin, who shouldn't even be here. She stood in the middle of the street in her bare feet and nightgown, her fists clenched at her sides, facing down a man 3 times her size with nothing but righteous fury. "Grace, no!" Reddick started forward, but Grace ignored him. "She's ours!" Grace shouted. "You can't have her. She belongs to us!" Cal laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Kid, you don't know what—" He never finished the sentence. Ruth had circled around behind him while everyone was focused on Grace, and she brought a large branch down on the back of Cal's head with all the strength in her 12-year-old body. The impact made a sickening crack, and Cal's grip on Lila loosened as he staggered. The gun went off. The sound was deafening, and for a moment Lila couldn't tell if she'd been hit. But then she realized the bullet had gone wide, striking the ground near the horse's hooves. The animal reared and bolted, and Cal stumbled backward, trying to keep his balance. Reddick moved like lightning. He tackled Cal before the man could recover, driving him into the dirt and pinning him there with brutal efficiency. Other men rushed forward to help. Elias, Tom the blacksmith, Margaret's son. Within seconds, Cal was disarmed and bound, his face pressed into the dirt while he cursed and spat. Lila stood frozen, her ears ringing from the gunshot, her body shaking with adrenaline. Then Emma was there, and Ruth, and Mary and Clara, and finally Grace, all of them wrapping around her like a living shield. She sank to her knees and pulled them close, burying her face in their hair while they cried and clung to her. "You're safe," Ruth kept saying, over and over like a prayer. "You're safe now. He can't hurt you." Reddick left Cal in the hands of the other men and came to kneel beside his daughters and Lila. He gathered all of them into his arms, an awkward, tangled embrace of 7 people who'd become something more than the sum of their parts. "Is everyone all right?" he asked, his voice rough. "Anyone hurt?" "Emma's arm," Ruth said, pulling back to show where bruises were already forming where Cal had grabbed her. "But she's okay. We're all okay." Miss Adelaide appeared with water and bandages. Margaret Foster brought blankets. Other women circled around them, offering comfort and protection. The men hauled Cal to the community hall and locked him in the root cellar that served as a makeshift jail, posting guards to make sure he couldn't escape. That evening, after Cal had been secured and the territorial marshal had been sent for, the settlement gathered in the community hall. Elias stood at the front with Reddick beside him, and one by one, people stood to speak. Tom the blacksmith said, "We don't tolerate men who threaten children. Not here. Not ever." Margaret Foster said, "Miss Carver has been nothing but kind and helpful since she arrived. She's one of us now, and we protect our own." Miss Adelaide said, "Those Reddick girls are brave as lions. Ruth especially. I've never seen anything like what she did today." And then Reddick spoke, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "Some of you have been wondering about Lila, about who she is and why she's with my family. The truth is simple. She's family. Not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the kind of love that shows up in action, not just words. She's been there for my daughters when I couldn't be. She's been there for me when I was drowning in grief and didn't even know it. And today, she was willing to die to protect Emma. So I'm asking all of you, no, I'm telling you, Lila Carver belongs here, with us. And anyone who has a problem with that can take it up with me personally." The room was silent for a moment. Then Margaret Foster started clapping, and soon everyone joined in. The sound filled the hall, and Lila felt tears streaming down her face. Not tears of fear this time, but tears of overwhelming gratitude and belonging. After the meeting, as they walked back to the cabin in the twilight, Grace slipped her hand into Lila's and looked up with solemn eyes. "Miss Lila?" "Yes, sweetheart? Are you going to stay with us forever now that the bad man is caught?" Lila glanced at Reddick, who was carrying Clara on his shoulders while the other girls walked ahead. He met her eyes and gave a small nod, as if to say the choice was hers. "Yes," Lila said, squeezing Grace's hand gently. "I'm staying forever." "Good," Grace said, satisfied, "because we're not done needing you yet." That night, after the girls were asleep, Lila and Reddick sat outside the cabin watching stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. The terror of the day was fading, replaced by exhausted relief in something else, something warm and uncertain and full of possibility. "I meant what I said," Reddick told her. "In the hall. Your family. I know. But I wonder—" He stopped, took a breath, started again. "I wonder if maybe you could be more than that, someday, when you're ready, if you want." Lila turned to look at him, this man who'd saved her from a cage and given her a home and stood beside her through fire and threats and danger. This man whose daughters called her name in the night and trusted her with their tears and their laughter and their fierce, wild love. "I think I might want that," she said softly. "Someday." Reddick smiled, and it transformed his whole face. "Then someday it is." They sat together in comfortable silence, watching the stars. While inside the cabin, 5 girls dreamed of a future where the only battles left to fight were the ordinary ones of growing up, and where love was measured not in grand gestures, but in steady presence and the courage to keep choosing each other, day after day after day. The territorial marshal arrived 3 days later with 2 deputies and a warrant for Cal Mercer's arrest. They took him away in irons, his face twisted with impotent rage, as he spat curses at Lila and promised vengeance, even as the wagon carried him toward a cell that would likely be his home for the rest of his life. The marshal assured them that between Cal's attack on Emma and the evidence connecting him to the fire that destroyed Reddick's ranch, he'd face a judge who wouldn't be sympathetic. His brother Royce already hanged 2 weeks back, the marshal told them as he prepared to leave. Judge said what he did was beyond the pale: arson, kidnapping, assault on a peace officer. The jury took less than an hour to convict. Cal will likely face the same fate, or at minimum, life in prison. Either way, Miss Carver, you won't have to worry about the Mercer brothers ever again. Lila felt something loosen in her chest that had been coiled tight for so long she'd almost forgotten what it felt like to breathe without that weight. "Thank you, Marshal." "No thanks needed. Just doing my job, though I will say—" He glanced at Reddick and the girls standing on the cabin porch. "You've got good people here, the kind who stand up when it matters. That's rarer than you might think." After the marshal left, life in Ward's Valley settled into a rhythm that felt almost startlingly normal. Reddick threw himself into clearing his land, working from dawn until dusk with help from the other men in the settlement. Elias brought his team of oxen to help pull stumps. Tom the blacksmith forged tools and taught Reddick how to repair them. Even Margaret Foster's teenage son, Daniel, spent his free afternoons helping dig post holes and split rails for fencing. The girls continued their schooling with Miss Adelaide, who reported that Ruth had a gift for mathematics, and Emma could recite entire passages of Shakespeare after hearing them just once. Mary discovered a love of drawing, covering slate boards with careful sketches of birds and flowers. Clara announced she wanted to be a doctor when she grew up, which made some of the more traditional women cluck their tongues. But Margaret Foster just laughed and said the world needed women who weren't afraid to dream big. Grace remained Grace, wild and loving and utterly fearless. She followed Lila everywhere, chattering constantly about everything and nothing, asking questions that ranged from "Why is the sky blue?" to "When are you going to marry Papa?" That last question had become more frequent as the weeks passed, asked not just by Grace but by the other girls in smaller, more careful ways. Ruth would mention how nice it was having Lila there in the mornings. Emma would talk about how much easier things were with 2 adults to manage the household. Mary would draw pictures of all 7 of them together, always making sure to include Lila. The community had noticed too. Lila saw it in the knowing glances the women exchanged when she and Reddick walked together through the settlement. Heard it in the way people referred to them as the Reddick family, with easy assumption that she was included. Felt it in how naturally she'd been absorbed into the rhythms of their life, until it was impossible to remember what it had been like before she belonged to them and they to her. 6 weeks after Cal's arrest, Reddick came home one evening with something hidden in his saddlebag. The girls had already eaten and were doing their evening chores, so Lila was alone in the cabin when he arrived. He looked nervous, which was unusual for him. His hands kept fidgeting with his hat, and he couldn't quite meet her eyes. "Something wrong?" Lila asked, setting down the dish she'd been washing. "No, maybe. I don't know." He took off his hat and ran his fingers through his hair. "I need to show you something, out by the creek. Can you come with me?" Lila dried her hands and followed him into the twilight. They walked in silence to the creek that bordered his land, where cottonwood trees grew thick and the water ran clear over smooth stones. The last of the day's light painted everything gold and amber, and somewhere nearby a thrush was singing its evening song. Reddick stopped at a small clearing overlooking the water. "This is where I want to build the house," he said. "Right here. Close enough to hear the creek, far enough back that we won't flood in spring. There's good drainage and the trees will shade it in summer. What do you think?" Lila looked at the spot he'd chosen, level ground with a view of the valley below, protected by hills on three sides, peaceful and beautiful and perfect. "It's wonderful. The girls will love it." "That's not what I'm asking." Reddick turned to face her, and in the fading light his eyes were serious. "I'm asking what you think. Because I'm not building a house for 6 people, Lila. I'm building it for 7. If you'll have us. If you'll have me." Lila's breath caught. They danced around this for weeks, both of them too careful or too scared to say out loud what everyone else could already see. But here, in the quiet of twilight with the creek singing beside them, there was no more room for careful or scared. "Jonah." "Let me finish," he said, holding up a hand. "I know I'm not much of a catch. A widower with 5 daughters and barely enough money to build a house, let alone support a family. I know you could do better, find a younger man or a richer one, or one who doesn't wake up in the night still grieving a woman who's been gone 3 years. But I also know that I love you, Lila Carver. I love your strength and your kindness and the way you sing to my daughters when you think no one's listening. I love how you fight for what's yours and how you never stopped believing you deserved better, even when the whole world told you different. And my girls, they already love you like you hung the moon. So I'm asking, right here and now, will you marry me? Will you let me build this house for you and spend the rest of my life trying to deserve you?" Tears were streaming down Lila's face, but she was smiling through them. "You already deserve me, you stubborn man. You deserved me the day you broke that cage and carried me out like I was something precious instead of trash. You deserved me every time you stood between me and danger without hesitation. You deserved me because you saw me when I was invisible, and you gave me a home when I'd forgotten what home felt like. Is that a yes?" "That's a yes." Lila laughed and cried at the same time. "Yes, I'll marry you. Yes, I'll help you build this house. Yes to all of it, today and tomorrow and every day after that." Reddick pulled something from his pocket, a simple silver ring, unadorned except for a single word engraved on the inside. He held it up so she could see. "Faith." "It was my grandmother's," he said quietly. "She gave it to me before she died, told me to save it for someone who'd earned it, someone who had faith even when the world gave them no reason to." "That's you, Lila. That's always been you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly. Then he pulled her close and kissed her, gentle and reverent, like a promise sealed. When they finally pulled apart, Lila rested her forehead against his and whispered, "When?" "Soon as the house is built. Soon as I can give you a proper home to be married in." He smiled. "Unless you want to wait longer. I know some women like time to prepare. I've been preparing my whole life for this," Lila interrupted. "For you and your daughters and this place. I don't need fancy or perfect. I just need you." They walked back to the cabin hand in hand, and when they opened the door, they found all 5 girls pressed against the window, clearly having watched the entire proposal. Grace let out a whoop of joy and launched herself at Lila, wrapping small arms around her waist. "You said yes! You said yes! I knew you would!" Ruth was crying quietly, and when Lila looked at her, the girl said, "Mama would be so happy. She always said Papa needed someone strong enough to stand beside him, not behind him. That's you, Miss Lila. That's always been you." Emma hugged Lila next, followed by Mary and Clara, and soon all of them were tangled together in the small cabin, laughing and crying and planning a wedding. They decided on a simple ceremony after the house was built, with the whole community invited. Miss Adelaide offered to make the wedding dress from fabric she'd been saving. Margaret Foster promised to bake a cake. Elias volunteered to officiate, having served as settlement preacher until they could afford to bring in someone permanent. The next 3 months passed in a blur of construction and preparation. The men of Ward's Valley came together for Reddick's barn raising, then stayed to help with the house. What would have taken 1 man a year took 30 men just 6 weeks. They framed walls and raised roof beams, installed windows, and built a stone fireplace that would keep the house warm through mountain winters. The women helped too, mixing plaster and sewing curtains and planning where furniture should go. Lila worked alongside them, learning carpentry from Tom and masonry from a stonemason named Hans who'd come from Germany. She insisted on helping build the room that would be hers and Reddick's, wanting to know that her own hands had shaped the space where they'd begin their life together. Ruth and Emma helped her sand the floorboards until they gleamed, and the younger girls gathered wildflowers to press between the pages of a Bible that Margaret had given them as an early wedding gift. The house took shape slowly, room by room, board by board. It was larger than the old one had been, 4 bedrooms instead of 2, a proper kitchen with a cast-iron stove, a front porch that wrapped around 2 sides, and a loft that could be used for storage or converted to additional space as the girls grew older. There was even a small room off the kitchen that Lila claimed for sewing and mending, a space of her own where she could work in peace. On a crisp October afternoon, exactly 3 months after Reddick's proposal, they moved into the finished house. The girls ran through the rooms, claiming spaces and hanging up their few possessions. Grace insisted on the bedroom closest to Lila and Reddick's, while Ruth and Emma chose the room with the best light for reading. Mary and Clara took the 3rd bedroom, already planning how they'd decorate and arrange their shared space. That evening, with the girls tucked into their new beds and the house settling into its own rhythms, Lila stood on the porch and looked out over the valley. Smoke rose from chimneys throughout the settlement, and she could hear distant laughter and the sound of someone playing a fiddle. It was peaceful in a way she'd never experienced, not the peace of absence or emptiness, but the peace of belonging and purpose and love freely given. Reddick came out to join her, draping a shawl over her shoulders against the evening chill. "What are you thinking about?" "How far we've come. How different everything is from that day in Sagebrush Hollow." She turned to face him. "Do you ever think about it? About what would have happened if you just kept riding?" "Every day," he admitted. "And every day I'm grateful I didn't. You saved me, Lila, just as much as I saved you, maybe more." "We saved each other," she corrected gently, "and your daughters saved both of us. That's how family works, I think. Everyone taking turns being strong when the others need it." The wedding was scheduled for the following Sunday, giving them 1 week to make final preparations. The community threw themselves into the celebration with enthusiasm that surprised and touched Lila. Women she barely knew showed up with gifts, quilts and cookware, jars of preserves and bags of seed for next year's garden. The men built tables for the reception and strung paper lanterns between the trees. Miss Adelaide finished the wedding dress, a simple but elegant gown of cream-colored muslin with lace at the collar and cuffs. The night before the wedding, Margaret Foster hosted a gathering for Lila at her house. Just the women of Ward's Valley, bringing food and stories and advice about married life. Some of it was practical, some of it was bawdy enough to make Lila blush, and all of it was delivered with warmth and acceptance. "You're one of us now," Margaret said, raising a cup of cider and toast. "Not because you're marrying Jonah, but because you've proven yourself. You've worked hard, stood strong, and loved those girls like they were your own. That's what makes family in Ward's Valley, not blood or ceremony, but choice and commitment. So, welcome, Lila Carver. Welcome home." Sunday morning dawned clear and bright, the kind of perfect autumn day that felt like a blessing. Lila woke early in the cabin, her last morning there before moving permanently into the new house, and found Ruth already up, heating water for washing. "Couldn't sleep either?" Ruth asked with a small smile. "Too excited," Lila admitted. "Too nervous. Too everything." "Papa's the same. I saw him at dawn, pacing the porch of the new house like a caged animal." Ruth poured warm water into the basin. "He loves you so much, Miss Lila. I've never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you. Not even Mama, though I know he loved her too. But with you, it's different, stronger, maybe. Or just more present. Like he's finally living again instead of just surviving. Lila felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back. I love him too, and I love all of you. I hope you know that. We know. Ruth hugged her impulsively. And we're so glad you're making it official. No more Miss Lila. After today, you'll be Mama to everyone, including me, if that's all right. That's more than all right, Lila whispered, holding the girl close. That's everything. The ceremony took place in the community hall, which had been decorated with autumn leaves and late-blooming wildflowers. Every family in Ward's Valley attended, packing the benches and spilling out onto the porch. The girls wore their best dresses, their hair carefully braided and adorned with small flowers. Emma and Mary stood as witnesses, while Ruth held Grace's hand to keep her from bouncing with excitement. Lila walked down the center aisle in her cream dress, her hair loose and crowned with a wreath of daisies that Clara had made. She'd never imagined herself as a bride, had spent so many years just trying to survive that marriage seemed like a luxury for other women. Women with homes and families and futures. But here she was, walking toward a man who'd seen her at her lowest and chosen to lift her up, toward daughters who'd opened their hearts without reservation, toward a life she'd stopped believing was possible. Reddick waited at the front in a new shirt and vest, his hair still damp from washing, his eyes bright with emotion. When Lila reached him, he took her hands in his and said quietly, so only she could hear, "You're beautiful, not just today, every day, but especially today." Elias performed the ceremony with appropriate solemnity mixed with warmth. He spoke about love being more than just feeling, about commitment being a daily choice, about family being built through sacrifice and service, and showing up even when it was hard. He talked about how Jonah and Lila had both known loss and hardship, and how those experiences hadn't made them bitter, but rather had taught them the true value of home and belonging. When it came time for vows, Reddick spoke first. "Lila, I promise to stand beside you in every storm and every joy. I promise to see you, truly see you, not just as the woman who helps with my daughters, but as yourself, strong and brave and deserving of every good thing. I promise to build you a life where you never have to be afraid again, and to love you with everything I have for as long as I draw breath." Lila's voice shook as she replied, "Jonah, I promise to choose you every day, in the hard times and the easy ones. I promise to love your daughters as my own, to honor the woman who came before me, and to build a home with you where everyone is welcome and everyone belongs. I promise to have faith in us, in this family, in the future we're creating together. And I promise to never forget that you saw me when I was invisible, and that changed everything." Elias pronounced them husband and wife, and when Reddick kissed her, the whole room erupted in cheers and applause. Grace shouted, "Finally!" loud enough to make everyone laugh, and then all 5 girls were surrounding them, pulling them into a group embrace that felt like the truest blessing of all. The reception lasted well into the evening, with food and music and dancing. Lila danced with Reddick, with each of the girls, with Elias and Tom, and even with shy Daniel Foster, who blushed bright red the whole time. She accepted congratulations from what felt like every person in the valley, each one welcoming her officially into the community she'd already claimed as her own. As the sun began to set, Reddick pulled her away from the celebration and led her to the new house. The girls were staying at Margaret's for the night, giving them privacy, and when they walked inside, Lila saw that someone, probably Ruth, had lit candles throughout the rooms and left a small meal waiting on the table. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reddick," Jonah said, lifting her hand to his lips. "Welcome home, Mr. Reddick," she replied with a smile. They ate quietly, exhausted but happy, and then Jonah led her to their bedroom, the one they'd built together, the one where they'd begin this new chapter. He was gentle and patient, understanding that while she'd survived much, she'd never experienced tenderness and intimacy. He made it good for her, made it feel like safety instead of surrender, like partnership instead of possession. Afterward, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lila felt something shift inside her, the last wall finally coming down, the last fear finally releasing its grip. She was no longer the woman in the cage. She was no longer defined by what had been done to her or what had been taken from her. She was simply Lila Reddick, wife and mother, and member of a community that had chosen her as completely as she'd chosen them. "What are you thinking?" Jonah asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her shoulder. "That I'm happy. Truly, deeply happy. I didn't know that was possible for me. It's possible. It's real. And it's just the beginning." He kissed her forehead. "We have a whole life ahead of us, Lila. Years and years of ordinary days and extraordinary moments. Of watching the girls grow up and building this ranch into something lasting. Of growing old together and boring our grandchildren with stories about how we met." Lila laughed softly. "They won't believe us. They'll think we're making it up. Then we'll just have to prove it to them by being living examples of what love looks like when it's tested and chooses to stay anyway." The first year of their marriage passed in seasons of work and joy. Winter came early to the valley, bringing snow that transformed the landscape into something magical and challenging. They spent long evenings by the fireplace, the girls doing lessons or playing games while Jonah whittled and Lila sewed. Grace learned to read and announced she was going to read every book in Miss Adelaide's schoolroom. Claire decided she still wanted to be a doctor and began memorizing anatomy from a medical text that Margaret had somehow acquired. Mary filled sketchbooks with drawings that got better and better. Emma developed a passion for cooking and spent hours experimenting with recipes. Ruth, nearly 13 now, started helping Lila teach the younger children and discovered she had a gift for patience and explanation. Spring brought planting season, and Lila learned alongside Jonah what crops grew best in mountain soil. They planted wheat and corn, potatoes and beans, established a kitchen garden that would feed them through summer and into fall. Lila discovered she loved working with the earth, loved the simple satisfaction of putting seeds in the ground and watching them grow. Summer was full of long days and community gatherings. The settlement had grown, new families arriving every month, drawn by reports of good land and fair dealing. Ward's Valley was becoming exactly what Elias had envisioned, a place where people could start over, where the past didn't define you and the future was whatever you had the courage to build. Lila found herself becoming a center point for the women of the valley. Her small sewing room became a gathering place where women came not just to learn stitching, but to share stories and seek advice. Some of them were running from their own pasts, bad marriages or crushing poverty or circumstances beyond their control. Lila listened and offered what wisdom she had, and slowly she realized that her own story wasn't just about survival. It was about transformation. It was proof that no matter how low you'd fallen, you could rise again if you found the right people to help you stand. One evening in late summer, as they sat on the porch watching fireflies dance in the gathering dusk, Jonah reached over and took her hand. "I have something to tell you." Lila's heart skipped. "What is it?" "I've been offered a position, teaching position. The settlement wants to build a proper school, and they want me to teach the older children, history, mathematics, literature. Miss Adelaide would keep the younger ones. They're offering fair pay and the chance to shape education here from the ground up." "That's wonderful. You'd be amazing at it. I wouldn't take it without your blessing. It would mean less time on the ranch, more responsibility to the community." Lila squeezed his hand. "Take it. Build the school. Teach the children. I can manage the ranch with Ruth and Emma's help. We'll make it work, just like we've made everything else work." So Jonah became a teacher, spending his days in a one-room schoolhouse that the men built that autumn. He taught frontier children to read Shakespeare and solve equations, to think critically and question thoughtfully. He was patient with those who struggled and challenging for those who excelled, and parents began requesting that their children study with him specifically. It was on a crisp October afternoon, exactly 1 year after their wedding, that Jonah came home with all 5 girls trailing behind him, their faces lit with barely contained excitement. Lila was in the garden, harvesting the last of the tomatoes when they arrived. "Lila, come here," Jonah called. "We have something for you." She set down her basket and walked over, curious. The girls were giggling and whispering to each other, clearly in on whatever surprise was coming. Jonah pulled something from his saddlebag, a bundle of fabric wrapped carefully. He handed it to Lila and said, "Open it." Inside was the most beautiful shawl Lila had ever seen, woven in shades of blue and green that reminded her of the valley in springtime. And pinned to it was a paper with careful writing, a poem the girls had composed together, each one contributing a line. "To Mama Lila, who was alone but isn't anymore. who was lost but found her way home, who was trapped but broke herself free, who was afraid but chose to be brave, who was ours before we knew we needed her. We love you forever and always. Your daughters. Lila read it 3 times, tears streaming down her face. Then she looked up at the 6 people who'd become her whole world and said, I love you too. All of you. More than words can say. Grace threw herself into Lila's arms, and soon all of them were together again. 7 people who'd found each other through tragedy and chosen to build something beautiful from the ruins. That evening, as Lila and Jonah stood on the porch watching the sun set behind the mountains, he slipped his arm around her waist and said, You know what tomorrow is? Saturday? The anniversary of the day I pulled you out of that cage, 1 year and 3 months ago. Sometimes it feels like a lifetime, and sometimes it feels like yesterday. Lila leaned into him, feeling the solid warmth of him, the steady beating of his heart. It was the day my life began. Everything before that was just surviving. Everything after has been living. Do you ever think about going back to see how different you are now? No. Lila's answer was immediate and certain. That woman in the cage is gone. I'm not her anymore. I'm Lila Reddick, mother of 5 daughters, wife to a good man, member of a community that values me. That's who I am now, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. They stood together in the fading light, watching as one by one the windows of Ward's Valley lit up with lamplight. Smoke rose from chimneys, children called to each other in the streets, and somewhere someone was playing a guitar while others sang along. This was home. Not the house, though Lila loved the house they'd built with their own hands. Not the land, though the ranch was thriving and would provide for them for years to come. Home was the people. Jonah and Ruth and Emma and Mary and Clara and Grace. Home was Margaret Foster bringing over soup when someone was sick, and Elias Ward checking in to see if they needed anything, and Miss Adelaide praising the girls' progress in school. Home was belonging to something larger than yourself, and knowing that you were seen and valued and loved. 3 years later, on a warm summer evening, Lila stood in that same spot on the porch, watching her daughters play in the yard. Ruth was 16 now, helping Miss Adelaide teach the younger students and being courted by Daniel Foster, who'd grown into a fine young man. Emma was 14 and had developed a reputation as the best baker in the valley, her bread and pies in constant demand. Mary was 12 and had covered every wall of her bedroom with sketches and paintings. Clara was 10 and still insisting she'd be a doctor, reading every medical text she could get her hands on. And Grace, sweet, wild Grace, was 8 years old and absolutely fearless, the child who'd saved Lila by refusing to let a grown man steal her away. The ranch was prosperous now, the fields green and productive, the livestock healthy and multiplying. The house had been expanded to include a larger sewing room where Lila taught women from across the territory the skills they needed to support themselves. She'd become known as someone who understood what it meant to start over, who could help women rebuild their lives after loss or escape or abandonment. She'd also discovered, to her joy and Jonah's delight, that she was expecting a child of her own, a baby due in the spring that would bind them together even more completely. The girls were beside themselves with excitement, already arguing about names and making plans for who would hold the baby first. As twilight deepened into night, Jonah emerged from the house and came to stand beside her. He'd aged well. Gray had spread through his hair and deepened at his temples, but his eyes were bright, and the sadness that had haunted them was gone, replaced by contentment and purpose. Happy? He asked, slipping an arm around her expanding waist. Impossibly happy, Lila replied. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to have all of this. You, the girls, the baby coming, this home we've built. It feels like a dream. It's real, and you deserve every bit of it. He turned her to face him, his hands gentle on her shoulders. You know what I realized today? What? That you saved me just as much as I saved you, maybe more. After Mercy died, I was just going through the motions, trying to keep the girls fed and clothed, but not really living. And then you came along, this fierce, broken, beautiful woman who refused to give up even when she had every reason to. You reminded me what it meant to fight for joy instead of just enduring grief. You gave my daughters a mother who chose them instead of being chosen by birth. You gave me a partner who stands beside me instead of behind me. You gave all of us a reason to build something lasting instead of just surviving day to day. Lila reached up and cupped his face in her hands. We saved each other. That's the truth of it. And we keep saving each other every day by choosing to show up and do the work and love each other, even when it's hard. He kissed her then, soft and sweet, a kiss that tasted like promise and homecoming and forever. When they pulled apart, Grace's voice called from inside the house. Mama, Papa, come see what Mary drew. It's all of us, even the baby. They went inside together, hand in hand, and found all 5 girls gathered around Mary's latest drawing. It showed the whole family standing in front of their house. 7 people, soon to be 8, all smiling, all together, all home. That night, after the girls were asleep and the house was quiet, Lila stood at the window of her bedroom, looking out at the valley she'd come to love. She thought about the woman she'd been in that cage in Sagebrush Hollow, desperate, afraid, convinced her life was over. She thought about everything that had happened since, the fire, the threats, the journey west, the fear that Cal would take everything away. She thought about the choices she'd made and the people who'd stood with her through all of it, and she thought about the future stretching ahead. Babies to raise and daughters to guide into adulthood, a ranch to maintain and a community to serve, years and years of ordinary miracles and extraordinary love. From cage to crown, her mother used to say, from ashes to beauty, from nothing to everything that matters. Lila Reddick, once Lila Carver, once a woman locked in a cage and left to die in the sun, placed her hand on her belly where new life grew and whispered a prayer of gratitude for the man who'd refused to look away, for the daughters who'd claimed her as their own, for the community that had given her a place to belong, and for the faith that had carried her through darkness into light. She was free. She was loved. She was home. And the story, which had begun in a cage in the scorching sun of a merciless town, ended in a house filled with laughter and lamplight, where a family slept peacefully under the same roof, where fear was just a memory, and where love had proven stronger than every threat and every shadow that had tried to tear them apart. This was her life now. This was her legacy. This was what happened when you refused to give up, when you found the courage to accept help, when you let yourself believe that you deserved more than survival. You deserved joy. You deserved belonging. You deserved a family that would fight for you as fiercely as you'd fight for them. And as she finally climbed into bed beside the man who'd become her husband, her partner, her home, Lila closed her eyes, knowing that tomorrow would bring new challenges and new gifts, that life would keep testing them and blessing them in equal measure, and that whatever came next, they would face it together, 7 hearts beating as one, a family forged not by blood, but by choice, by courage, by the transforming power of love that sees past cages and ashes to the truth of who someone really is. They were home. They were whole. They were free. And that was everything.